Funding for this program was provided by Friends of Iowa Public Television, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, generations of families and friends who feel passionate about Iowa public television programs.
As a result, we now have an opportunity to actually fundamentally course correct. And the media have a huge responsibility here, because the mainstream media suffer from ADD, attention deficit disorder. They cover a story and then they quickly move on to the other story.
On May 4, 2010, in Des Moines, Iowa, political commentator Arianna Huffington presented a keynote address at Planned Parenthood of the Heartland's annual fundraiser. Ms. Huffington is co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post, author of 12 books, a nationally syndicated columnist, and co-host of a public radio political roundtable program. In 2009, she was included in Forbes' first-ever list of the most influential women in media. This is Intelligent Talk Television.
Thank you so much. This was, without any doubt, the best introduction I have ever had. And I just wanted you to keep going and keep going. Thank you. I hope I can call you on the phone and we can talk. This has been an amazing evening so far for me, just getting to know some extraordinary women and men, Democratic women and Republican ones, the old-fashioned kind of Republican women and men, and just men and women who care passionately about this country and about what's happening to those less privileged, and about what Michael talked about, equality and fairness. So I just loved meeting so many people here tonight, including Connie, who was sitting next to me at dinner, and what an extraordinary life. And having then the idea that Connie and the former Joy, the former lieutenant governor, having a 75th birthday party, and the proceeds went to Planned Parenthood. I mean, that's how I want to celebrate my 75th birthday. As the mother of two daughters, one is 21 and the other 18, I just learned to value Planned Parenthood all over again as a mother. I'm sure glad you're there. And I know that millions of women and their daughters around the country really have learned to value from experience the work that Planned Parenthood is doing. And talking to some of the volunteers here and hearing about the stories of going to the hospital and seeing women arriving afraid and anxious, and being given not just the medical and physical support, but the emotional support they need at those times. That's the kind of work that we're celebrating here tonight, and I want to thank you all very much for supporting that work. Especially at this time, because we are living at a moment in history which is particularly dangerous when it comes to the forces of fear that are collectively around us. And when we look at the economic anxiety that's spreading and the impact it's having, we recognize the importance of having the kind of civic engagement that is manifested here tonight, more important than ever, because however much we are looking to government to solve problems, these problems cannot be solved without the engagement of people like you here tonight. So I want to divide what I'm going to say into three parts. The first is a look at what's happened around us, to our political system, what's happening at this particular moment. The second is what is the role of the media in all that's happening. And the third is finally, what is the role of giving back in our own communities. So starting with what's happening to our politics and our economic system. Michael mentioned that I got a degree in economics, and For a long time, I never quite understood why I got a degree in economics, because I was writing biographies and books on Greek mythology, and suddenly the economic meltdown happened, and I'm sure glad I had a degree in economics. Not just because of understanding things, but also because I studied economics at Cambridge, and I studied in a library called the Alfred Marshall Library. And Alfred Marshall was one of the founding fathers of capitalism. And one of the concepts that he developed was the concept of economic chivalry. The idea that capitalism could not survive if there wasn't a moral foundation to it, which is also what Adam Smith also wrote about, because before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, which he celebrated Bible of capitalism, he had written The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was again about that need for a moral foundation. And what was demonstrated over the last few months especially is that we've lost track of that moral foundation. So when we read about the BP oil spill, or when we read about the mining disaster that killed 29 miners, we see that something has gone wrong. When we begin to put profits above people and greed above ethics, something happens to a country that, if it is not corrected, will take us in a direction we don't want to go. And what makes this particularly urgent is the fact that we are seeing the state of the middle class at the moment, and it's not a good one. America, and I speak as a naturalized American, has always been this beacon because of the American dream being about upward mobility. And now, for the first time, millions are facing downward mobility. We have a new class now, the formerly middle class. And I've talked to some of you tonight who are seeing a lot of these women who are out of a job, who don't know what they're going to do with their children, how they're going to get their kids to college, how they're going to pay for all their needs. And we have the statistics to back it up. We have 1 in 5 people right now are out of work. 1 out of 9 people cannot really make their payments to their credit cards. 1 out of 9 people also have a house that is either in foreclosure or about to be foreclosed. And we have a lot of this formerly middle class visiting food banks on a regular basis, the very places where they only used to visit in order to volunteer there. So I think it's imperative that we kind of sound an alarm, because very often what has happened in the last few years is that after the iceberg hits the Titanic, we sit around and tell each other how nobody could have imagined that. Remember, we had that conversation after Katrina. Nobody could have imagined the levees breaking. Well, a lot of people had predicted it. Then we had nobody could have imagined an economic meltdown. A lot of people had predicted it. We heard again and again how what's happening with the oil spill was unprecedented, again, impossible to imagine, but it had happened before on a smaller scale. And the companies had paid their fines and had gone on, not having to admit wrongdoing, then did it again. So this is this critical moment in our country where we really still have a window to reform and course correct. But it's only a window. And many of our great masters of the universe got it wrong. As Alan Greenspan himself admitted, he told a House committee in October, he made a mistake in presuming that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks and others, were such that they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders and the equity in their firms. So we've all made some false assumptions that we now need to re-examine and to get back to that essential that de Tocqueville described as one of the greatest things about America, an equality of conditions. We cannot expect to have an equality of circumstances, but we must expect to have an equality of conditions. And that's getting harder and harder. In California, where I live a lot of my time, you now have the University of California raising tuition by 30%, which suddenly puts a state university out of the reach of many qualified students, which is why community colleges are becoming increasingly popular. That and the need for many to go back and re-educate themselves. So when we look at what is happening in the country, and we activate that compassion, that sense of reaching out to those beyond our own immediate family and immediate friends, we recognize the urgency of what is happening. I was in Pompeii this summer, and it was amazing to see how easy it is to ignore the warning signs when they're happening. Apparently, the dogs were fleeing Pompeii, and a lot of unnatural things were happening, but people were going on their usual way. And I'd written a section in one of my books on Greek mythology about Cassandra. You know, she was not a very popular character because people don't like to hear sometimes bad news, especially Greek peasant girls, Michael, and Americans, because we all are in our DNA really optimistic people. But sometimes signing the warnings is really the greatest sign of leadership. It's really, for me, the ultimate sign of leadership is seeing the iceberg before it hits the Titanic. Because once it's hit the Titanic, everybody can see it and feel it. So right now, the particular danger we're facing is that in times of economic anxiety, a lot of people operate not from their rational brains, but from their lizard brains. And as a result, they believe an enormous amount of unbelievable things, like the president was not born in this country. I was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner on Saturday, and he joked about it. He said that his approval ratings are going down everywhere except in the country of his birth. And as a result, we now have an opportunity to actually fundamentally course correct. And the media have a huge responsibility here, because the media, the mainstream media, suffer from ADD, attention deficit disorder. They cover a story and then they quickly move on to the other story. But mercifully, we in the online media suffer from OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So we stay on a story and stay on a story until something breaks through the static, which is why, I have assigned a couple of our correspondents to specifically do nothing else but put flesh and blood on the economic data. So you can actually read what it means to lose your home. You can read the stories of people who've lost their homes and had to move their children into a motel or a trailer and get them to school. And if we don't tell the stories, we're not going to capture people's imagination, because people respond to stories. Do you remember the balloon boy? Well, anyway, he wasn't really a balloon boy, he was an attic boy, but be that as it may, I remember I was going on the Ed show that day and to talk about Afghanistan, and Ed said to me, we must talk about the balloon boy. And I said, why must we talk about the balloon boy? Especially after he had been found by then in the attic. And he said, well, the American people want to know about it. But the truth is that it depends on what we give the American people. If we gave them gripping stories of what's happening around the country at the moment to millions of families, they would want to hear about that. So I had this idea that maybe we could just build a giant balloon and put inside, the hundreds of thousands of homeless children or pregnant teenage girls or any of the major crisis points to get people's attention. Come to think of it, we don't even have to put them in them. We can just pretend we're putting them in them. And then we'll just have a flying object, and journalists will pay attention and be incredibly compassionate about it. You remember we had anchors really worrying that the little balloon boy was cold. And we have kids in our inner cities, dying in drive-by shootings. And we're not worrying about them 1% of the amount of worry that we're expending on these sensational stories, whether it's the balloon boy or Elian Gonzalez. Does anybody here remember Elian Gonzalez? 3 covers of Time magazine, wall-to-wall coverage, and then suddenly it stopped. And I don't know if anybody knows what happened to him. Does he like Cuba? Does he like his dad? It was over. And I remember at the same time that all this Elian Gonzalez obsession was going on, Jonathan Kozol had written a book called Ordinary Resurrections about a little boy called Elio in the Bronx, whose dad was in jail, who could not sleep at night because of all the shootings going on. And there are hundreds of thousands of little boys and little girls around the country that require that kind of compassion and attention from us. And I know all of you who are here care about that. And I feel if enough people, it's never going to be everybody, but if a critical mass of people care about those that we need to raise, whose conditions and circumstances we need to improve, we are going to be able to do that. And it's great to be here in Iowa, because just before we came out, Michael was telling me, some of the history of the Iowa Supreme Court. And the fact that 10 years before your estate, the Supreme Court actually decided in favor of the slave in the Ralph case. And then all the way down to this year, when the Supreme Court voted in favor, unanimously, of the gay marriage. And yet now, in your governor's race, you have Republican candidates vying with each other who is going to be the most anti-immigration. So that's why when I hear the whole conversation in Washington about bipartisanship, how we must be bipartisan and go to the middle, I wonder what that really means. Because it wasn't bipartisanship that gave us the Emancipation Proclamation. It took a civil war to get the Emancipation Proclamation. Imagine if people at the time were saying, you know what, Mr. President, you just got to split the difference. Just go to the middle. Just be nice. Have a beer summit. And, just free half the slaves. Or free them from 9 to 5. I don't really know how you compromise on absolute things. How do you compromise around the 19th Amendment? Or how do you compromise around providing Social Security or Medicare? So we need to remember that these issues are not about right versus left. They're about right versus wrong. And when it comes to right, versus wrong, the truth is not found by splitting the difference and going to the middle. It's a little bit like Galileo. Imagine when Galileo knew scientifically that the Earth revolved around the sun. He couldn't just say, okay, I'm going to go to the Pope and we'll split the difference and we'll create some kind of navigation maps that will kind of fudge it. And yet, the media still are acting as though the truth is to be found by splitting the difference, and that it's neither on the one side, not or the other, but in some kind of mythical middle, the mushy middle. And that's why you have these endless debates where the anchor, the moderator, is supposedly the objective one, and on the one hand you have, let's say, Al Gore talking about the dangers of global warming, and on the other you have Senator James Inhofe talking about how global warming is a fraud And supposedly, you can just make up your mind about it. But there is such a thing as truth. And when the media act like Pontius Pilate, washing their hands off the truth, they are not doing their job. And increasingly, both mainstream media and online media have to deal with the issue of trust. Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist, said recently that trust is the new black. And the most important thing for any media organization is to be trusted. And that's why I think there's going to be a growing influence and a growing importance on fact-checking, accuracy, and transparency. I would love to see a kind of technological tool that when a politician or a pundit says something, like, for example, just to take a completely idle example, Senator Chuck Grassley talking about death panels, right? Wouldn't you love, at the moment he's saying it, not a minute later, to have a little bubble go up that has the provision from the bill that clearly indicates that there's nothing about death panels in the bill. And I want that technological fact-checking tool to be completely bipartisan, which means that when the president says, I did not campaign for the public option, I want a little bubble to go up that shows him campaigning for the public option. And at the same time, I want to see some real context around what is being said, because we have such a short memory that people say something that turns out to be completely wrong, and then a few months later they reappear on the talk circuit and they just say something that could be equally wrong, but nobody holds them accountable for what they had already said in the past. I mean, I was recently on Morning Joe with Mayor Giuliani, and he was there to endorse Rubio, while Christ was still in the race in Florida. And I just had to tell him, I said, didn't you also endorse Kirk to be the head of Homeland Security, and he's now in jail? Shouldn't we really question your judgment a little bit here? So let me just end with the third point, because I want to leave lots of room for questions. So my third point was something I wanted to talk about even before I came here, but sitting next to Susie Buffett at dinner and talking to her about what she's doing in Omaha made me want to talk about it even more, because we both agreed that even though there's tremendous need to do a lot internationally when it comes to giving back, philanthropy, volunteerism, there is also a tremendous need to do a lot at home. There is at the moment a growing need, in fact, because as social services are being cut in every state, it was kind of ironic that recently the over 30 states around the country had to cut their budgets to the tune of $180 billion, which was exactly the amount we had given AIG. So this is part of the double standard that is really upsetting people around the country. But because of that, because of where we are at this moment, it is all the more important that we take care of people in our own backyard. It's not either or. Many people can afford to do both, and there are going to be people who will exclusively give internationally. But the needs here are growing at a rate which at some point is going to turn us into a third world country. Because what is the essence of a third world country? It's when you don't have a middle class, when you have those who are well off and those who are struggling, and nothing in between. And I'm doing a book about this, which is why I'm kind of a little obsessing about it. But what I've discovered in my research, that the middle class is not just the foundation of our economy, it's also the foundation of our democracy. And so at this moment, we need to do everything we can to deal with all these major crises in our own inner cities, whether it's gangs, whether it's girls teenage girls getting pregnant, whether it's kids who go to school completely unprepared, all these specific problems. But if we can actually begin to address them at the level where we're actually living, it can begin to transform the country. And so every time I get pessimistic about what's happening, I look at what people are doing around the country and say, if we can just scale it up, if we can just accelerate what we're doing, we can really have a huge impact on this downward trend that is at the moment the dominant characteristic of what is happening. And of course, what is particularly powerful about that is that it's not just those we're giving to who are helped. We are actually transforming ourselves in the act of giving. And I've had that experience with my own daughters when they've gone through difficult times of their own. Volunteering has been one of their ways that they have found themselves again. And there's no question. I don't want to preach to the converted because you wouldn't be here if you didn't believe in giving back. I don't want to be like Claire Booth-Luce, who was a convert to Catholicism when she was given an audience with the Pope, and she started extolling Catholicism. And the Pope interrupted her at one point and said, "Madam Booth-Luce, you forget I'm already a Catholic." So I don't want you to remind me that you're already Catholics, but because I know that you are already believers in what I'm saying. But I just feel that right now what we're dealing with is really looking at the leader in the mirror. Instead of looking outside ourselves to find the leaders who are going to save us, looking at the leader in the mirror and discovering our own leadership potential, as so many of you here have done, and acting on it. And if enough of us do that, we'll really begin to transform what is happening in the country. And that, for me, is just how we can turn a crisis into a greater opportunity. Because we will not just get things to where they were before the crisis occurred. We will make them better. We will get to a place where people recognize that giving back and reaching beyond our own preoccupations is also at the essence of a full and complete life. When the Founding Fathers wrote about the pursuit of happiness, they did not have in mind the pursuit of shopping or having fun or all the things that are perfectly legitimate, fun things, but not at the essence of what we're doing. There, if you go back and read what the pursuit of happiness was, it was the pursuit of feeling good by doing good. And at the heart of it is that sense of gratitude about our own lives that comes from that giving back. One of my favorite sayings is from Colette, the French writer, who said, "There were many wonderful things in my life. I just wish I had realized them sooner." And so, as we're here coming together to celebrate a great cause and looking outside at all the great needs, let's just commit ourselves to creating that critical mass that can actually transform our country to the country that it was meant to be and to that more perfect union. Thank you.
We have several questions here. We have about 15 minutes. We have several questions here from the audience. And the first one is, whom do you consider the most important influence in your thinking, especially politically?
Well, actually, politically, the most important influence has actually been through my years at Cambridge. You know, I mentioned Alfred Marshall because that whole idea of economic chivalry has been sort of key to my thinking. And even when I was a Republican, you know, until 1996, I hope you have forgiven me. My Republican thinking was still driven by that sense of economic chivalry. The difference was that when I was a Republican, I thought that the private sector would solve all these problems and that we didn't need government. So what changed was my understanding of the role of government, that in fact the problems were too monumental to be solved without the raw power of government appropriations. So I go back to his writing and to my understanding of what he meant by economic chivalry.
Next question is, what do you consider to be the most serious issue in the U.S. or world today?
I think unquestionably the most serious issue is these huge discrepancies, these income discrepancies. Just to give you an idea, 30 years ago, CEOs of the biggest S&P companies were making 30 times more than their workers. Today, they're making 300 times more. So there's been like this stagnation in the wages of many, while basic things like healthcare and education have been going up in cost. And that is very troubling when you look at what makes a healthy democracy. And I'm convinced that we'll get it right, because in the end, as Winston Churchill said, you know, Americans will do the right thing after they've tried everything else. But I also do have that sense of urgency when I look around and when I read the stories that are coming to us at the Huffington Post from people who can't make ends meet and who had a perfectly good life until a few months ago. It's not something that you can easily dismiss or easily solve. And what is so interesting is that when Lehman Brothers collapsed, and there was that sense of impending doom and the fact that, you know, we all had to come together and do something, we threw everything against the wall, right? And the idea was we'll try everything because we cannot afford to let the financial system collapse. So I want that same sense of urgency to say, you know what, the middle class in America is under assault, and we need to do everything to make sure that it doesn't collapse. That sense of urgency means that we'll try things that some of them will fail and some of them will succeed, but accepting a failure rate in order to get it right is the only way we're going to get it right.
A little background, Iowa is one of the very few states that's never elected a woman to Congress or a woman as governor. This question is, how can we in Iowa get women, and it's only been 150 years, how can we in Iowa get women elected to Congress and the governor's chair?
Well, how about the Senate?
Well,
you have an opportunity right now to elect a woman to the Senate and stop having to have bubbles over Senator Grassley's head.
well, I can't read this one, but I'm sure it's a great question.
You can make it up.
Who is the most interesting, thought-provoking person you have ever interviewed or written about, and why?
Well, right now, I would say that one of the most interesting and thought-provoking people that I've ever met and talked to is Elizabeth Warren, who is, you know, a Harvard law professor and the Congressional Oversight Chair of the TARP Committee, and who has been a passionate advocate for the middle class, and who also, she comes from Oklahoma, and she has this very straightforward way of talking, and she can go on Stephen Colbert's show and on Jon Stewart and on Bill Maher and be really like this kind of down-to-earth grandmother who says it like it is and can really communicate with the American people. And we need more of her because there aren't that many people that the American people trust.
This person says, I absolutely agree with the concept of the necessity of a moral underpinning of capitalism, but how do you think that can be achieved?
Well, I think it can be achieved by making certain things unacceptable. You see, we didn't get here by accident. We didn't get here because suddenly Lehman collapsed. This has been happening for 30 years. We gradually sort of deregulated the economy. We took away, the foundations that had been put together by FDR, including abolishing Glass-Steagall. We quickly declared things solved and move on. Remember, we had Enron and WorldCom and all that collapse, and then we thought, okay, we handle things, we're moving on, and then what happens? 6 years later, things collapse at a much higher level. The same happened in the mining industry. The same happens in the oil industry. So we just really need to recognize that the old order has in many ways exhausted itself. And we need to think anew. I mean, let me just give you one example of why this system is not working at the moment. Recently, we had the SEC declare that the Bank of America had to pay a fine for not telling its shareholders about the bonuses that had been given to Merrill Lynch. Do you remember? And Judge Rakoff, bless his heart, these are the kind of heroes I love, said to the SEC, not really, just come again, just tell me more. Why are they just going to get away with paying a $30 million fine, which is nothing? And he wanted to get more information. Well, in the end, they ended up paying $150 million, which is still, as he said, was not really how it should have been resolved, because the bottom line was that they did that without having to admit wrongdoing. And that's the double standard. If you've done wrong, you've got to admit wrongdoing. Otherwise, people are left with that sense that there are two standards, one that applies to ordinary citizens and one to those who are playing by different rules, and that's not sustainable in a democracy.
Let me give you 5 quick names and just give me your top-of-the-head reaction. Mayor Bloomberg.
Right now, I love what he's doing about gun control. We just have the top of the Huffington Post right now is about the fact that we are basically making it easier for terrorists who are threatening America to buy guns. It doesn't make any sense. People who just think that that's the way to honor the Constitution, the Second Amendment, just need to rethink it.
Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi.
Nancy Pelosi did a fantastic job helping get health care through, and she'll always be remembered and honored for that.
Mitch McConnell.
Well, Mitch McConnell is acting at the moment as though he's in a debating society. And whatever the president or Harry Reid proposes, he feels he has to oppose, even if it's something that he liked 24 hours earlier. Like the Deficit Commission. They were all in favor of the Deficit Commission. Then the president wanted a Deficit Commission. Suddenly they didn't want a Deficit Commission. Well, governing is not like debating. And he'd better wake up and recognize that.
Timothy Geithner.
Timothy Gartner is a really nice man.
Is that it?
No, he's a really good man. But his view of the world is so Wall Street-centric that he really can't help himself. It's not that he's not well-intentioned. It's not that he doesn't want the best. But he basically thinks that as long as Wall Street is doing fine, everybody will be okay. And we're seeing that's not the case. There's been a kind of decoupling between the Wall Street economy and the real economy. So I'd love to have somebody there who thinks that as long as Main Street is okay, we'll be okay.
What's good for General Motors is good for the USA.
Yeah.
Barack Obama.
Barack Obama came to power because of Iowa, so thank you for that, That was a big night, and if you had not elected him here, I doubt he would have gone on to be the nominee. So that's very significant. He spoke and campaigned on what was happening to the middle class. He called it his North Star. He said the people are being hosed, the system is broken, And I remember one of my favorite lines of his in Denver was, we cannot bring in the same people to do things the same way, expecting different results. And yet, in many ways, he has brought in some of the same people. So I think that he, partly because constitutionally, he does want to bring everybody together. He does want to have a consensus. He needs to recognize that in many areas of fundamental change, you are not going to have a consensus until you bring about the fundamental change. And, you know, there is no job that prepares you for being President of the United States. So all the great presidents have learned on the job. So it's all about course correcting. You're never going to get it right from the beginning completely. All the great presidents course corrected. The bad presidents did not course correct. So my hope is that he will keep course correcting and doing things better and getting us out of Afghanistan quickly. That's going to be one of the key things that I think will determine his presidency, because that was one of the major mistakes that he's made. And ironically, he's president because in 2002, he got it right about Iraq. He gave that great speech where he said, I'm not against war, I'm against dumb wars. And Afghanistan right now is a dumb war. It's not in Americans' national security interest. We are making more enemies every day by bombing people at weddings and children. And the whole point here is, again, course correcting, recognizing when something is not going in the direction we want, when we're basically supporting a president who is deranged, who is inviting Ahmadinejad into the Kabul palace, who is threatening to join the Taliban, and he is our partner. You know, come on. It's time to recognize what is in America's national security interest and what is not, and to act accordingly.
You should know that our guest has to be in New York at 9 tomorrow morning. You should also know that it's reasonably difficult to get to New York at 9 tomorrow morning from Des Moines, that the hourly flights stop at 8. And so when she leaves here, she is being driven to Chicago to catch an early flight to New York. So first of all, thank you very much for the sacrifice. Thank you very much for being here. You've been wonderful. Let me ask you one final question that a member of the audience has suggested, which is, are you optimistic about the world?
I'm more optimistic after tonight. I'm completely serious. I'm more optimistic after tonight because I met so many people who are really spending part of their life doing things for others, caring for women who need help and support, caring for children, caring for people in need, working in concrete ways to create the country that we want to live in. And really, that's all that it's going to take. In the end, we are not going to be able to change the circumstances that so many people are living in without our own participation. And so at the same time that we are doing all the things that so many of you are also engaged in, like electing the right candidates and lobbying government to do the right thing, which is getting harder and harder, and being a countervailing force to the lobbying interest in Washington, as long as we are doing all these things and at the same time doing the concrete things of supporting institutions like Planned Parenthood that are doing the real work day in, day out of helping people go through life in ways that are not so disadvantaged and so difficult, then yes, I am optimistic, because in the end, I feel that that's how we bring a kind of grace to what we're doing and deal with the inevitable struggle of life. And ironically, as I said during my speech, that's not just good for those we're helping, but it also transforms our own life and our own sense of fulfillment because we are engaged in something beyond our own immediate interests and preoccupations. So thank you so much for making me more optimistic. And don't worry, that's when I said to Michael that I'm a strong Greek peasant girl. No problem driving to Chicago.
Thank you very, very much for being here.
Funding for this program was provided by Friends of Iowa Public Television, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, generations of families and friends who feel passionate about Iowa public television programs.